Bill the Bloodhound by P.G. Wodehouse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dan Gurzinski. Bill the Bloodhound by P.G. Wodehouse. There's a divinity that shapes our ends. Consider the case of Henry Pifield Rice, detective. I must explain Henry early to avoid disappointment. If I simply said he was a detective and let it go at that, I should be obtaining the reader's interest under false pretenses. He was really only a sort of detective, a species of sleuth. At Stafford's International Investigation Bureau, in the Strand, where he was employed, they did not require him to solve mysteries which had baffled the police. He had never measured a footprint in his life, and what he did not know about bloodstains would have filled a library. The sort of job they gave Henry was to stand outside a restaurant in the rain and note what time someone inside left it. In short, it is not Pifield Rice, Investigator Number 1, The Adventure of the Maharaja's Ruby, that I submit to your notice, but the unsensational doings of a quite commonplace young man, variously known to his comrades at the Bureau as Fathead, That Blighter What's-His-Name, and Here You. Henry lived in a boarding house in Guildford Street. One day a new girl came to the boarding house and sat next to Henry at meals. Her name was Alice Weston. She was small and quiet and rather pretty. They got on splendidly. Their conversation, at first confined to the weather and the moving pictures, rapidly became more intimate. Henry was surprised to find that she was on the stage in the chorus. Previous chorus girls at the boarding house had been of a more pronounced type. Good girls, but noisy and apt to wear beauty spots. Alice Weston was different. "I'm rehearsing at present," she said. "I'm going out on tour next month in The Girl from Brighton. What do you do, Mr. Rice?" Henry paused for a moment before replying. He knew how sensational he was going to be. "I'm a detective." Usually, when he told girls his profession, squeaks of amazed admiration greeted him. Now he was chagrined to perceive in the brown eyes that met his distinct disapproval. "What's the matter?" he said, a little anxiously, for even at this early stage of their acquaintance he was conscious of a strong desire to win her approval. "Don't you like detectives?" "I don't know. Somehow, I shouldn't have thought you were one." This restored Henry's equanimity somewhat. Naturally, a detective does not want to look like a detective and give the whole thing away right at the start. "I think you won't be offended." "Go on." "I've always looked on it as a sneaky job." "Sneaky?" moaned Henry. "Well, creeping about, spying on people." Henry was appalled. She had defined his own trade to a nicety. There might be detectives whose work was above this reproach, but he was a confirmed creeper and he knew it. It wasn't his fault. The boss told him to creep, and he crept. If he declined to creep, he would be sacked instanter. It was hard, and yet he felt the sting of her words, and in his bosom the first seeds of dissatisfaction with his occupation took root. You might have thought that this frankness on the girl's part would have kept Henry from falling in love with her. Certainly the dignified thing would have been to change his seat at table and take his meals next to someone who appreciated the romance of detective work a little more. But no, he remained where he was, and presently Cupid, who never shoots with a surer aim than through the steam of boarding-house hash, sniped him where he sat. He proposed to Alice Weston. She refused him. "It's not because I'm not fond of you. I think you're the nicest man I ever met." A good deal of assiduous attention had enabled Henry to win this place in her affections. He had worked patiently and well before actually putting his fortune to the test. "I'd marry you tomorrow if things were different. But I'm on the stage, and I mean to stick there. Most of the girls want to get off it, but not me. And one thing I'll never do is marry someone who isn't in the profession. My sister Genevieve did, and look what happened to her. She married a commercial traveler. And take it from me, he traveled. She never saw him for more than 5 minutes in the year, except when he was selling gents' hosiery in the same town where she was doing her refined specialty. And then he'd just wave his hand and whiz by and start traveling again. My husband has got to be close by, where I can see him. I'm sorry, Henry, but I know I'm right. It seemed final, but Henry did not wholly despair. He was a resolute young man. You have to be to wait outside restaurants in the rain for any length of time. He had an inspiration. He sought out a dramatic agent. I want to go on the stage in musical comedy. Let's see you dance. I can't dance. Sing? Said the agent. Stop singing, added the agent hastily. You go away and have a nice cup of hot tea, said the agent soothingly, and you'll be as right as anything in the morning. Henry went away. A few days later, at the bureau, his fellow detective Simmons hailed him. Here, you! The boss wants you. Buck up. Mr. Stafford was talking into the telephone. He replaced the receiver as Henry entered. Oh, Rice, here's a woman wants her husband shadowed while he's on the road. He's an actor. I'm sending you. Go to this address and get photographs and all particulars. You'll have to catch the 11 o'clock train on Friday. Yes, sir. He's in The Girl from Brighton Company. They open at Bristol. It sometimes seemed to Henry as if fate did it on purpose. If the commission had had to do with any other company, it would have been well enough, for, professionally speaking, it was the most important with which he had ever been entrusted. If he had never met Alice Weston and heard her views upon detective work, he would have been pleased and flattered. Things being as they were, it was Henry's considered opinion that fate had slipped one over on him. In the first place, what torture to be always near her, unable to reveal himself, to watch her while she disported herself in the company of other men. He would be disguised, and she would not recognize him, but he would recognize her, and his sufferings would be dreadful. In the second place, to have to do his creeping around and spying, practically in her presence. Still, business was business. At 5 minutes to 11, on the morning named, he was at the station, a false beard and spectacles shielding his identity from this public eye. If you had asked him, he would have said he was a Scots businessman. As a matter of fact, he looked far more like a motor car coming through a haystack. The platform was crowded. Friends of the company had come to see the company off. Henry looked on discreetly from behind a stout porter, whose bulk formed a capital screen. In spite of himself, he was impressed. The stage at close quarters always thrilled him. He recognized celebrities. The fat man in the brown suit was Walter Jelliffe, the comedian and star of the company. He stared keenly at him through the spectacles. Others of the famous were scattered about. He saw Alice. She was talking to a man with a face like a hatchet, and smiling, too, as if she enjoyed it. Behind the matted foliage which he had inflicted on his face, Henry's teeth came together with a snap. In the weeks that followed, as he dogged The Girl from Brighton Company from town to town, it would be difficult to say whether Henry was happy or unhappy. On the one hand, to realize that Alice was so near and yet so inaccessible was a constant source of misery. Yet, on the other, he could not but admit that he was having the very dickens of a time loafing around the country like this. He was made for this sort of life, he considered. Fate had placed him in a London office, but what he really enjoyed was this unfettered travel. Some gypsy strain in him rendered even the obvious discomforts of theatrical touring agreeable. He liked catching trains. He liked invading strange hotels. Above all, he reveled in the artistic pleasure of watching unsuspecting fellow-men as if they were so many ants. That was really the best part of the whole thing. It was all very well for Alice to talk about creeping and spying, But if he considered it without bias, there was nothing degrading about it at all. It was an art. It took brains and a genius for disguise to make a man a successful creeper and spyer. You couldn't simply say to yourself, "I will creep." If you attempted to do it in your own person, you would be detected instantly. You had to be an adept at masking your personality. You had to be one man at Bristol and another quite different man at Hull, especially if, like Henry, you were of a gregarious disposition and liked the society of actors. The stage had always fascinated Henry. To meet even minor members of the profession off the boards gave him a thrill. There was a resting juvenile of fit-up caliber at his boarding house who could always get a shilling out of him simply by talking about how he had jumped in and saved the show at the hamlets which he had visited in the course of his wanderings. And on this Girl from Brighton tour, he was in constant touch with men who really amounted to something. Walter Jelliffe had been a celebrity when Henry was going to school, and Sidney Crane, the baritone, and others of the lengthy cast were all players not unknown in London. Henry courted them assiduously. It had not been hard to scrape acquaintance with them. The principals of the company always put up at the best hotel, and, his expenses being paid by his employer, so did Henry. It was the easiest thing possible to bridge with a well-timed whiskey and soda the gulf between non-acquaintance and warm friendship. Walter Jelliffe, in particular, was peculiarly accessible. Every time Henry accosted him, as a different individual, of course, and renewed in a fresh disguise the friendship which he had enjoyed at the last town, Walter Jelliffe met him more than halfway. It was in the 6th week of the tour that the comedian, promoting him from a mere casual acquaintanceship, invited him to come up to his room and smoke a cigar. Henry was pleased and flattered. Jelliffe was a personage, always surrounded by admirers, and the compliment was consequently of a high order. He lit his cigar among his friends at the Green Room Club. It was unanimously held that Walter Jelliffe's cigars brought him within the scope of the law forbidding the carrying of concealed weapons. But Henry would have smoked the gift of such a man if it had been a cabbage leaf. He puffed away contentedly. He was made up as an old Indian colonel that week, and he complimented his host on the aroma with a fine old-world courtesy. Walter Jelliffe seemed gratified. "Quite comfortable?" he asked. "Quite, I thank you," said Henry, fondling his silver mustache. "That's right. And now tell me, old man, which of us is it you're trailing?" Henry nearly swallowed his cigar. "What do you mean?" "Oh, come," protested Jelliffe. "There is no need to keep it up with me. I know you're a detective. The question is, who's the man you're after? That's what we've all been wondering all this time." All? They had all been wondering? It was worse than Henry could have imagined. Till now he had pictured his position with regard to the Girl from Brighton company rather as that of some scientist who, seeing but unseen, keeps a watchful eye on the denizens of a drop of water under his microscope. And they had all detected him, every one of them. It was a stunning blow. If there was one thing on which Henry prided himself, it was the impenetrability of his disguises. He might be slow, he might be on the stupid side, but he could disguise himself. He had a variety of disguises, each designed to befog the public more hopelessly than the last. Going down the street, you would meet a typical commercial traveler, dapper and alert. Anon, you encountered a heavily bearded Australian. Later, maybe, it was a courteous old retired colonel who stopped you and inquired the way to Trafalgar Square. Still later, a rather flashy individual of the sporting type asked you for a match for his cigar. Would you have suspected for one instant that each of these widely differing personalities was in reality one man? Certainly you would. Henry did not know it, but he had achieved, in the eyes of the small servant who answered the front doorbell at his boarding house, a well-established reputation as a humorist of the more practical kind. It was his habit to try his disguises on her. He would ring the bell, inquire for the landlady, and when Bella had gone, leap up the stairs to his room. Here he would remove the disguise, resume his normal appearance, and come downstairs again, humming a careless air. Bella, meanwhile, in the kitchen, would be confiding to her ally, the cook, that Mr. Rice had just come in, looking sort of funny again. He sat and gaped at Walter Jelliffe. The comedian regarded him curiously. "You look at least 100 years old," he said. "What are you made up as? A piece of gorgonzola?" Henry glanced at the mirror. Yes, he did look rather old. He must have overdone some of the lines in his forehead. He looked something between a youngish centenarian and a nonagenarian who had seen a good deal of trouble. "If you knew how you were demoralizing the company," Jelliffe went on, "you would drop it. As steady and quiet a lot of boys as ever you met till you come along. Now they do nothing but bet on what disguise you're going to choose for the next town. I don't see why you need to change so often. You were all right as the Scotsman at Bristol. We were all saying how nice you looked. You should have stuck to that. But what do you do at Hull but roll in a scrubby mustache and a tweed suit looking rotten? However, all that is beside the point. It's a free country. If you like to spoil your beauty, I suppose, there's no law against it. What I want to know is who's the man. Whose track are you sniffing on, Bill? You'll pardon my calling you Bill. You're known as Bill the Bloodhound in the company. Who's the man?" "Never mind," said Henry. He was aware, as he had made it, that it was not a very able retort, but he was feeling too limp for satisfactory repartee. Criticisms in the bureau, dealing with his alleged solidity of skull, he did not resent. He attributed them to man's natural desire to chaff his fellow man. But to be unmasked by the general public in this way was another matter. It struck at the root of all things. "But I do mind," objected Jelliffe. "It's most important. A lot of money hangs on it. We've got a sweepstakes on in the company, the holder of the winning name to take the entire receipts. Come on, who is he?" Henry rose and made for the door. His feelings were too deep for words. Even a minor detective has his professional pride, and the knowledge that his espionage is being made the basis of sweepstakes by his quarry cuts this to the quick. "Here, don't go. Where are you going?" "Back to London," said Henry bitterly. "It's a lot of good my staying here now, isn't it?" "I should say that it was, to me. Don't be in a hurry. You're thinking that, now we know all about you, your utility as a sleuth has waned to some extent. Is that it?" "Well?" "Well, why worry? What does it matter to you? You don't get paid by results, do you? Your boss said, trail along. Well, do it then. I should hate to lose you. I don't suppose you know it, but you've been the best mascot this tour that I've ever come across. Right from the start, we've been playing it to enormous business. I'd rather kill a black cat than lose you. Drop the disguises and stay with us. Come behind all you want and be sociable." A detective is only human. The less of a detective, the more human he is. Henry was not much of a detective, and his human traits were consequently highly developed. From a boy, he had never been able to resist curiosity. If a crowd collected in the street, he always added himself to it, and he would have stopped to gape at a window with "Watch this window" written on it, if he had been running for his life from wild bulls. He was, and always had been, intensely desirous of someday penetrating behind the scenes of a theater. And there was another thing. At last, if he accepted this invitation, he would be able to see and speak to Alice Weston and interfere with the maneuvers of the hatchet-faced man on whom he had brooded with suspicion and jealousy since that first morning at the station. To see Alice, perhaps with eloquence, to talk her out of that ridiculous resolve of hers. "Why, there's something in that," he said. Rather. Well, that's settled. And now, touching that sweep, who is it? I can't tell you that. You see, so far as that goes, I'm just where I was before. I can still watch, whoever it is I'm watching. Dash it, so you can. I didn't think of that, said Jalif, who possessed a sensitive conscience. Purely between ourselves, it isn't me, is it? Henry eyed him inscrutably. He could look inscrutable at times. Ah, he said, and left quickly with the feeling that, however poorly he had shown up during the actual interview, his exit had been good. He might have been a failure in the matter of disguise, but nobody could have put more quiet sinisterness into that "ah." It did much to soothe him and ensure a peaceful night's rest. On the following night, for the first time in his life, Henry found himself behind the scenes of a theater, and instantly began to experience all the complex emotions which came to the layman in that situation. That is to say, he felt like a cat which had strayed into a strange, hostile backyard. He was in a new world, inhabited by weird creatures who flitted about in an eerie semi-darkness, like brightly colored animals in a cavern. The Girl from Brighton was one of those exotic productions specially designed for the tired businessman. It relied for a large measure of its success on the size and appearance of its chorus, and on their constant change of costume. Henry, as a consequence, was the center of a kaleidoscopic whirl of feminine loveliness, dressed to represent such varying flora and fauna as rabbits, Parisian students, colleens, Dutch peasants, and daffodils. Musical comedy is the Irish stew of the drama. Anything may be put into it with the certainty that it will improve the general effect. He scanned the throng for a sight of Alice. Often as he had seen the piece in the course of its 6 weeks' wandering in the wilderness, he had never succeeded in recognizing her from the front of the house. Quite possibly, he thought, she might be on the stage already, hidden in a rose tree or some other shrub, ready at the signal to burst forth upon the audience in short skirts, for in The Girl from Brighton, almost anything could turn suddenly into a chorus girl. Then he saw her among the daffodils. She was not a particularly convincing daffodil, but she looked good to Henry. With wobbling knees, he butted his way through the crowd and seized her hand enthusiastically. "Why, Henry, where did you come from?" "I am glad to see you." "How did you get here?" "I am glad to see you." At this point, the stage manager, bellowing from the prompt box, urged Henry to desist. It is one of the mysteries of behind-the-scenes acoustics that a whisper from any minor member of the company can be heard all over the house, while the stage manager can burst himself without annoying the audience. Henry, awed by authority, relapsed into silence. From the unseen stage came the sound of someone singing a song about the moon. June was also mentioned. He recognized the song as one that had always bored him. He disliked the woman who was singing it, a Miss Clarice Weaver, who played the heroine of the piece to Sidney Crane's hero. In his opinion, he was not alone. Miss Weaver was not popular in the company. She had secured the role rather as a testimony of personal esteem from the management than because of any innate ability. She sang badly, acted indifferently, and was uncertain what to do with her hands. All these things might have been forgiven her, but she supplemented them by the crime known in stage circles as throwing her weight about. That is to say, she was hard to please, and when not pleased, apt to say so in no uncertain voice. To his personal friends, Walter Jelliffe had frequently confided that, though not a rich man, he was in the market with a substantial reward for anyone who was man enough to drop a ton of iron on Miss Weaver. Tonight the song annoyed Henry more than usual, for he knew that very soon the daffodils were due on the stage to cinch the verisimilitude of the scene by dancing the tango with the rabbits. He endeavored to make the most of the time at his disposal. "I am glad to see you," he said. "Shh," said the stage manager. Henry was discouraged. Romeo could not have made love under these conditions. And then, just when he was pulling himself together to begin again, she was torn from him by the exigencies of the play. He wandered moodily off into the dusty semi-darkness. He avoided the prompt box, whence he could have caught a glimpse of her, being loath to meet the stage manager just at present. Walter Jelliffe came up to him as he sat on a box and brooded on life. "A little less of the double forte, old man," he said. "Miss Weaver has been kicking about the noise on the side. She wanted you thrown out, but I said you were my mascot, and I would die sooner than part with you. But I should go easy on the chest notes, I think, all the same." Henry nodded moodily. He was depressed. He had the feeling which comes so easily to the intruder behind the scenes that nobody loved him. The piece proceeded. From the front of the house, roars of laughter indicated the presence on the stage of Walter Jelliffe, while now and then a lethargic silence suggested that Miss Clarice Weaver was in action. From time to time, the empty space about him filled with girls dressed in accordance with the exuberant fancy of the producer of the piece. When this happened, Henry would leap from his seat and endeavor to locate Alice, but always, just as he thought he had done so, the hidden orchestra would burst into melody and the chorus would be called to the front. It was not till late in the second act that he found an opportunity for further speech. The plot of The Girl from Brighton had by then reached a critical stage. The situation was as follows. The hero, having been disinherited by his wealthy and titled father for falling in love with the heroine, a poor shop girl, has disguised himself by wearing a different colored necktie, and has come in pursuit of her to a well-known seaside resort, where, having disguised herself by changing her dress, she is serving as a waitress in the rotunda on the esplanade. The family butler, disguised as a bath chairman, has followed the hero, and the wealthy and titled father, disguised as an Italian opera singer, has come to the place for a reason which, though extremely sound, for the moment eludes the memory. Anyhow, he is there, and they all meet on the esplanade. Each recognizes the other, but thinks he himself is unrecognized. Exeunt all, hurriedly, leaving the heroine alone on the stage. It is a crisis in the heroine's life. She meets it bravely. She sings a song entitled "My Honolulu Queen," with chorus of Japanese girls and Bulgarian officers. Alice was one of the Japanese girls. She was standing a little apart from the other Japanese girls. Henry was on her with a bound. Now was his time. He felt keyed up, full of persuasive words. In the interval which had elapsed since their last conversation, yeasty emotions had been playing the dickens with his self-control. It is practically impossible for a novice, suddenly introduced behind the scenes of a musical comedy, not to fall in love with somebody. And if he is already in love, his fervor is increased to a dangerous point. Henry felt that it was now or never. He forgot that it was perfectly possible, indeed the reasonable course, to wait till the performance was over and renew his appeal to Alice to marry him on the way back to her hotel. He had the feeling that he had got just about a quarter of a minute. Quick action! That was Henry's slogan. He seized her hand. "Alice!" "Shh!" hissed the stage manager. "Listen, I love you. I'm crazy about you. What does it matter whether I'm on the stage or not? I love you. Stop that row there. Won't you marry me?" She looked at him. It seemed to him that she hesitated. "Cut it out!" bellowed the stage manager, and Henry cut it out. And at this moment, when his whole fate hung in the balance, there came from the stage that devastating high note, which is the sign that the solo is over and that the chorus are now about to mobilize. As if drawn by some magnetic power, she suddenly receded from him and went to the stage. A man in Henry's position and frame of mind is not responsible for his actions. He saw nothing but her. He was blind to the fact that important maneuvers were in progress. All he understood was that she was going from him, and that he must stop her and get this thing settled. He clutched at her. She was out of range and getting farther away every instant. He sprang forward. The advice that should be given to every young man starting life is, if you happen to be behind the scenes at a theater, never spring forward. The whole architecture of the place is designed to undo those who so spring. Hours before, the stage carpenters have laid their traps, and in the semi-darkness you cannot but fall into them. The trap into which Henry fell was a raised board. It was not a very highly raised board. It was not so deep as well, nor so wide as a church door. But 'twas enough. It served. Stubbing it squarely with his toe, Henry shot forward, all arms and legs. It is the instinct of man in such a situation to grab at the nearest support. Henry grabbed at the Hotel Superba, the pride of the Esplanade. It was a thin wooden edifice, and it supported him for perhaps a tenth of a second. Then he staggered with it into the limelight, tripped over a Bulgarian officer who was inflating himself for a deep note, and finally fell in a complicated heap as exactly in the center of the stage as if he had been a star of years' standing. It went well, there was no question of that. Previous audiences had always been rather cold towards this particular song, but this one got on its feet and yelled for more. From all over the house came rapturous demands that Henry should go back and do it again. But Henry was given no encores. He rose to his feet, a little stunned, and automatically began to dust his clothes. The orchestra, unnerved by his unrehearsed infusion of new business, had stopped playing. Bulgarian officers and Japanese girls alike seemed unequal to the situation. They stood about, waiting for the next thing to break loose. From somewhere far away came faintly the voice of the stage manager, inventing new words, new combinations of words, and new throat noises. And then Henry, massaging a stricken elbow, was aware of Miss Weir at his side. Looking up, he caught Miss Weaver's eye. A familiar stage direction of melodrama reads, "Exit cautious through gap in hedge." It was Henry's first appearance on any stage, but he did it like a veteran. "My dear fellow," said Walter Jelliffe. The hour was midnight, and he was sitting in Henry's bedroom at the hotel. Leaving the theater, Henry had gone to bed almost instinctively. Bed seemed the only haven for him. "My dear fellow, don't apologize. You've put me under lasting obligations. In the first place, with your unerring sense of the stage, you saw first the spot where the piece needed livening up, and you livened it up. That was good. But far better was it that you also sent our Miss Weaver into violent hysterics, from which she emerged to hand in her notice. She leaves us tomorrow." Henry was appalled at the extent of the disaster for which he was responsible. "What will you do?" "Do? Why, it's what we have all been praying for. A miracle which should eject Miss Weaver. It needed a genius like you to come to bring it off. Sidney Crane's wife can play the part without rehearsal. She understudied it all last season in London. Crane has just been speaking to her on the phone, and she is catching the night express." Henry sat up in bed. "What?" "What's the trouble now? Sidney Crane's wife?" "What about her?" A bleakness fell upon Henry's soul. "She was the woman who was employing me. Now I shall be taken off the job and have to go back to London." "You don't mean that it was really Crane's wife?" Jelliffe was regarding him with a kind of awe. "Laddie," he said in a hushed voice, "you almost scare me. There seems to be no limit to your powers as a mascot. You fill the house every night, you get rid of the Weaver woman, and now you tell me this. I drew Crane in the sweep, and I would have taken twopence for my chance of winning it. I shall get a telegram from my boss tomorrow recalling me. Don't go. Stick with me. Join the troupe." Henry stared. "What do you mean? I can't sing or act." Jaleef's voice thrilled with earnestness. "My boy, I can go down the Strand and pick up 100 fellows who can sing and act. I don't want them. I turn them away. But a seventh son of a seventh son like you, a human horseshoe like you, a king of mascots like you, they don't make them nowadays. They've lost the pattern. If you like to come with me, I'll give you a contract for any number of years you suggest. I need you in my business." He rose. "Think it over, laddie, and let me know tomorrow. Look here upon this picture and on that. As a sleuth, you are poor. You couldn't detect a bass drum in a telephone booth. You have no future. You are merely among those present. But as a mascot, my boy, you're the only thing in sight. You can't help succeeding on the stage. You don't have to know how to act. Look at the dozens of good actors who are out of jobs. Why? Unlucky. No other reason. With your luck and a little experience, you'll be a star before you know you've begun. Think it over and let me know in the morning." Before Henry's eyes there rose a sudden vision of Alice. Alice, no longer unattainable. Alice, walking on his arm down the aisle. Alice, mending his socks. Alice, with her heavenly hands, fingering his salary envelope. "Don't go," he said. "Don't go. I'll let you know now." The scene is the Strand, hard by Bedford Street. The time, that restful hour of the afternoon, when they of the gnarled faces and the bright clothing gather together in groups to tell each other how good they are. Hark! A voice! "Rather. Courtnage and the governor keep on trying to get me, but I turn them down every time. No, I said to Maloney only yesterday. Not for me. I'm going with old Wally Jaleef, the same as usual, and there isn't the money in the mint that'll get me away. Maloney got all worked up. It is the voice of Pyfield Rice, actor. End of Bill the Bloodhound by P.G. Wodehouse.
The Caballero's Way by O. Henry. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothman. The Caballero's Way by O. Henry. The Cisco Kid had killed 6 men in more or less fair scrimmages, had murdered twice as many, mostly Mexicans, and had winged a larger number whom he modestly forebode to count. Therefore, a woman loved him. The Kid was 25, looked 20, and a careful insurance company would have estimated the probable time of his demise at, say, 26. His habitat was anywhere between the Frio and the Rio Grande. He killed for the love of it, because he was quick-tempered, to avoid arrest, for his own amusement. Any reason that came to his mind would suffice. He had escaped capture because he could shoot 5/6 of a second sooner than any sheriff or ranger in the service, and because he rode a speckled roan horse that knew every cow path in the mesquite and pear thickets from San Antonio to Matamoros. Tonia Perez, the girl who loved the Cisco Kid, was half Carmen, half Madonna, and the rest, oh yes, a woman who is half Carmen and half Madonna can always be something more. The rest, let us say, was Hummingbird. She lived in a grass-roofed jacal near a little Mexican settlement at the Lone Wolf Crossing of the Frio. With her lived a father, or grandfather, a lineal Aztec, somewhat less than 1,000 years old, who herded 100 goats and lived in a continuous drunken dream from drinking mezcal. Back of the jacal, a tremendous forest of bristling pear, 20 feet high at its worst, crowded almost to its door. It was along the bewildering maze of this spinous thicket that the speckled roan would bring the kid to see his girl. And once, clinging like a lizard to the ridgepole high up under the peaked grass roof, he heard Tonia, with her Madonna face and Carmen beauty and hummingbird soul, parley with the sheriff's posse, denying any knowledge of her man in her soft melange of Spanish and English. One day the adjutant general of the state, who is ex officio commander of the ranger forces, wrote some sarcastic lines to Captain Duval of Company X, stationed at Laredo, relative to the serene and undisturbed existence led by murderers and desperadoes in the said captain's territory. The captain turned the color of brick dust under his tan and forwarded the letter, after adding a few comments per Ranger Private Bill Adamson, to Ranger Lieutenant Sandridge, camped at a water hole on the Nueces, with a squad of 5 men in preservation of law and order. Lieutenant Sandridge turned a beautiful color de rosa through his ordinary strawberry complexion, tucked the letter in his hip pocket, and chewed off the ends of his gamboge mustache. The next morning he saddled his horse and rode along to the Mexican settlement at the Lone Wolf crossing of the Frio, 20 miles away. 6'2", blond as a Viking, quiet as a deacon, dangerous as a machine gun, Sandridge moved along the Jacales, patiently seeking news of the Cisco Kid. Far more than the law, the Mexicans dreaded the cold and certain vengeance of the lone rider that the Rangers sought. It had been one of the Kid's pastimes to shoot Mexicans, to see 'em kick. If he demanded from them moribund terpsichore feats simply that he might be entertained, what terrible and extreme penalties would be certain to follow should they anger him? One and all, they lounged with upturned palms and shrugged shoulders, filling the airs with quien sabes and denials of the Kid's acquaintance. But there was a man named Fink who kept a store at the crossing, a man of many nationalities, tongues, interests, and ways of thinking. "No use asking them Mexicans," he said to Sandridge. "They're afraid to tell. This hombre they call the Kid, Goodall's his name, ain't it? He's been in my store once or twice. I have an idea that you might run across him but I guess I don't care to say, myself. I'm 2 seconds later in pulling a gun than I used to be, and the difference is worth thinking about. But this Kid's got a half-Mexican girl at the crossing that he comes to see. She lives in that jacal 100 yards down the arroyo at the edge of the pear. Maybe no, I don't suppose she would. But that jacal would be a good place to watch, anyway." Sandridge rode down to the jacal of Perez. The sun was low, and the broad shade of the great pear thicket already covered the grass-thatched hut. The goats were enclosed for the night in a brush corral nearby. A few kids walked on top of it, nibbling at the chaparral leaves. The old Mexican lay on the blanket on the grass, already in a stupor from his mezcal, and dreaming, perhaps, of the nights when he and Pizarro touched glasses to their new world fortunes, so old his wrinkled face seemed to proclaim him to be. And in the door of the jacal stood Tonia, and Lieutenant Sandridge sat in his saddle, staring at her like a gannet agape at a sailorman. The Cisco Kid was a vain person, as all eminent and successful assassins are, and his bosom would have been ruffled had he known that at a simple exchange of glances 2 persons, in whose mind he had been looming large, suddenly abandoned, at least for a time, all thought of him. Never before had Tonia seen such a man as this. He seemed to be made of sunshine and blood-red tissue and clear weather. He seemed to illuminate the shadow of the pear when he smiled, as though the sun were rising again. The men she had known were small and dark. Even the Kid, in spite of his achievements, was a stripling no larger than herself, with black, straight hair and cold marble face that chilled the noonday. As for Tonia, though she sends description to the poorhouse, let her make a millionaire of your fancy. Her blue-black hair smoothly divided in the middle and bound close to her head, and her large eyes, full of the Latin melancholy, gave her the Madonna touch. Her motions and air spoke of a concealed fire and the desire to charm that she had inherited from the Ganatas of the Basque province. As for the hummingbird part of her that dwelt in her heart, you could not perceive it unless her bright red skirt and dark blue blouse gave you a symbolic hint of the vagarious bird. The newly lighted sun god asked for a drink of water. Tonia brought it from the red jar hanging under the brush shelter. Sandridge considered it necessary to dismount so as to lessen the trouble of her ministrations. I play no spy, nor do I assume to master the thoughts of any human heart, but I assert by the chronicler's right that before a quarter of an hour had sped, Sandridge was teaching her how to pliant a 6-strand rawhide stake rope, and Tonia had explained to him that were it not for her little English book that the peripatetic padre had given her, and the crippled little chivo that she fed from the bottle, she would be very, very lonely indeed. Which leads to the suspicion that the kid's fences needed repairing, and that the Adjutant General's sarcasm had fallen upon unproductive soil. In his camp by the waterhole, Lieutenant Sandridge announced and reiterated his intention of either causing the Cisco Kid to nibble the black loam of the Frio County prairies, or of hailing him before a judge and jury. That sounded businesslike. Twice a week he rode over to the Lone Wolf Crossing of the Frio and directed Tonia's slim, slightly lemon-tinted fingers among the intricacies of the slowly growing lariata. A 6-strand pliant is hard to learn, but easy to teach. The ranger knew that he might find the kid there at any visit. He kept his armament ready and had a frequent eye for the pear thicket at the rear of the jacal. Thus he might bring down a kite and a hummingbird with one stone. While the sunny-haired ornithologist was pursuing his studies, the Cisco Kid was also attending to his professional duties. He moodily shot up a saloon in a small cow town on Quintana Creek, killed the town marshal, plugging him neatly in the center of his tin badge, and then rode away, morose and unsatisfied. No true artist is uplifted by shooting an aged man carrying an old-style .38 bulldog. On his way, the kid suddenly experienced the yearning that all men feel when wrongdoing loses its keen edge of delight. He yearned for the woman he loved to reassure him that she was his in spite of it. He wanted her to call his bloodthirstiness bravery and his cruelty devotion. He wanted Tonia to bring him water from the red jar under the brush shelter and tell him how the chivo was thriving on the bottle. The kid turned the speckled roan's head up the 10-mile pear flat that stretches along the Arroyo Hondo until it ends at the Lone Wolf Crossing of the Frio. The roan whinnickered, for he had the sense of locality and direction equal to that of the Beltline streetcar horse, and he knew he would soon be nibbling the rich mesquite grass at the end of the 40-foot stake rope while Ulysses rested his head in Circe's straw-roofed hut. More weird and lonesome than the journey of an Amazonian explorer is the ride of one through a Texas pear flat. With dismal monotony and startling variety, the uncanny and multiform shapes of the cacti lift their twisted trunks and flat, bristled hands to encumber the way. The demon plant, appearing to live without soil or rain, seems to taunt the parched traveler with its lush gray-greenness. It warps itself 1,000 times about what look to be open and inviting paths, only to lure the rider into a blind and impassable spine-defended bottoms of the bag, leaving him to retreat, if he can, with the points of the compass whirling in his head. To be lost in the pear is to die almost the death of the thief on the cross, pierced by nails, with grotesque shapes of all the fiends hovering about. But it was not so with the kid and his mount. Winding, twisting, circling, tracing the most fantastic and bewildering trail ever picked out, the good roan lessened the distance to the Lone Wolf Crossing with every coil and turn that he made. While they fared, the kid sang. He knew but one tune and sang it, as he knew but one code and lived it, and but one girl and loved her. He was a single-minded man of conventional ideas. He had a voice like a coyote with bronchitis, but whenever he chose to sing his song, he sang it. It was a conventional song of the camps and trail, running at its beginning as near as may be to these words: "Don't you monkey with my Lulu girl, or I'll tell you what I'll do," and so on. The roan was inured to it, and did not mind. But even the poorest singer will, after a certain time, gain his own consent to refrain from contributing to the world's noises. So the Kid, by the time he was within a mile or two of Tonia's jacal, had reluctantly allowed his song to die away, not because his vocal performance was less than charming to his own ears, but because his laryngeal muscles were aweary. As though he were in a circus ring, the speckled roan wheeled and danced through the labyrinth of pear, until at length his rider knew by certain landmarks that the Lone Wolf Crossing was close at hand. Then, where the pear was thinner, he caught sight of the grass roof of the jacal and the hackberry tree on the edge of the arroyo. A few yards further the Kid stopped the roan and gazed intently through the prickly opening. Then he dismounted, dropped the roan's reins, and proceeded on foot, stooping and silent like an Indian. The roan, knowing his part, stood still, making no sound. The Kid crept noiselessly to the very edge of the pear thicket and reconnoitered between the leaves of the clump of cactus. 10 yards from his hiding place in the shade of the jacal sat his Tonia, calmly planting a rawhide lariat. So far she might surely escape condemnation. Women have been known from time to time to engage in more mischievous occupations. But if all must be told, there is to be added that her head reposed upon the broad and comfortable chest of the tall red and yellow man, and that his arm was about her, guiding her nimble fingers that required so many lessons at the intricate 6-strand pliant. Sandridge glanced quickly at the dark mass of pear when he heard a slight squeaking sound that was not altogether unfamiliar. A gun scabbard will make that sound when one grasps the handle of a 6-shooter suddenly. But the sound was not repeated, and Tonia's fingers needed close attention. And then, in the shadow of death, they began to talk of their love, and in the still July afternoon every word they uttered reached the ears of the Kid. "Remember, then," said Tonia, "you must not come until I send for you. Soon he will be here. A vaquero at the tienda said today he saw him at the Guadalupe 3 days ago. When he is that near he always comes. If he comes and finds you here, he will kill you. So for my sake, you must come no more until I send you the word." "All right," said the stranger. "And then what?" "And then," said the girl, "you must bring your men here and kill him. If not, he will kill you." "He ain't a man to surrender, that's sure," said Sandridge, "and it's kill or be killed for the officer that goes up against Mr. Cisco Kid." "He must die," said the girl. "Otherwise there will not be any peace in the world for thee and me. He has killed many. Let him so die. Bring your men and give him no chance to escape." "You used to think right much of him," said Sandridge. Tonia dropped the lariat, twisted herself around, and curved a lemon-tinted arm over the ranger's shoulder. "But then," she murmured in liquid Spanish, "I had not beheld thee, thou great red mountain of a man, and thou art kind and good as well as strong. Could one choose him, knowing thee? Let him die, for then I will not be filled with fear by day and night lest he hurt thee or me." "How can I know when he comes?" asked Sandridge. "When he comes," said Tonia, "he remains 2 days, sometimes 3. Gregorio, the small son of old Luisa, the lavanderia, has a swift pony. I will write a letter to thee and send it by him, saying how it will be best to come upon him. By Gregorio will a letter come, and bring many men with thee, and have much care, O dear red one, for the rattlesnake is not quicker to strike than El Chivato, as they call him, to send a ball from his pistola." "The Kid's handy with his gun, sure enough," admitted Sandridge. "But when I come for him, I shall come alone. I'll get him by myself or not at all. The Cap wrote 1 or 2 things to me that make me want to do the trick without any help. You let me know when Mr. Kid arrives, and I'll do the rest." "I will send you the message by the boy Gregorio," said the girl. "I knew you were braver than that small slayer of men who never smiles. How could I ever have thought I cared for him? It was time for the ranger to ride back to his camp on the waterhole. Before he mounted his horse, he raised the slight form of Tonia with one arm high from the earth for a parting salute. The drowsy stillness of the torpid summer air still lay thick upon the dreaming afternoon. The smoke from the fire in the jacal, where the frijoles bubbled in the iron pot, rose straight as a plumb line above the clay-daubed chimney. No sound or movement disturbed the serenity of the dense pear thicket 10 yards away. When the form of Sandridge had disappeared, loping his big dun down the steep banks of the Frio crossing, the Kid crept back to his own horse, mounted him, and rode back along the tortuous trail he had come. But not far. He stopped and waited in the silent depths of the pear until a half an hour had passed. And then Tonia heard the high, untrue notes of his unmusical singing coming ever nearer and nearer, and she ran to the edge of the pear to meet him. The Kid seldom smiled, but he smiled and waved his hat when he saw her. He dismounted, and his girl sprang into his arms. The Kid looked at her fondly. His thick black hair clung to his head like a wrinkled mat. The meeting brought a slight ripple of some undercurrent of feeling to his smooth, dark face that was usually as motionless as a clay mask. "How's my girl?" he asked, holding her close. "Sick of waiting so long for you, dear one," she answered. "My eyes are dim with always gazing into that devil's pincushion through which you come. And I can see into it such a little way, too. But here you are, beloved one, and I will not scold. Que mal muchacho, not to come to see your Alma more often. Go in and rest, and let me water your horse and stake him with the long rope. There is cool water in the jar for you." The Kid kissed her affectionately. "Not if the court knows itself do I let a lady stake my horse for me," he said. "But if you'll run in, chica, and throw a pot of coffee together while I'm attending to the caballo, I'll be a good deal obliged." Besides his marksmanship, the Kid had another attribute for which he admired himself greatly. He was muy caballero, as the Mexicans express it, where the ladies were concerned. For them he had always gentle words and consideration. He could not have spoken a harsh word to a woman. He might ruthlessly slay their husbands and brothers, but he could not lay the weight of one finger in anger upon a woman. Wherefore many of that interesting division of humanity who had come under the spell of his politeness declared their disbelief in the stories circulating about the Kid. One shouldn't believe everything one heard, they said. When confronted by their indignant menfolk with the proof of the caballero's deeds of infamy, they said maybe he had been driven to it, and that he knew how to treat a lady anyhow. Considering this extremely courteous idiosyncrasy of the Kid, and the pride he took in it, one can perceive that the solution of the problem that was presented to him by what he saw and heard from his hiding place in the pear that afternoon, at least as to one of the actors, must have been obscured by difficulty. And yet no one could think of the Kid overlooking little matters of that kind. At the end of the short twilight they gathered around the supper of frijoles, goat steaks, canned peaches, and coffee, by the light of the lantern in the jacal. Afterward the ancestor, his flock corralled, smoked a cigarette and became a mummy in the gray blanket. Tonia washed a few dishes while the Kid dried them with a flour sack towel. Her eyes shone. She chatted volubly about the inconsequent happenings of her small world since the Kid's last visit. It was as all his other homecomings had been. Then outside, Tonia swung in a grass hammock with her guitar and sang sad canciones de amor. "Do you love me just the same, old girl?" asked the Kid, hunting for his cigarette papers. "Always the same, little one," said Tonia, her dark eyes lingering upon him. "I must go to Fink's," said the Kid, rising, "for some tobacco. I thought I had another sack in my coat. I'll be back in a quarter of an hour." "Hasten," said Tonia, "and tell me, how long shall I call you my own this time? Will you be gone tomorrow, leaving me to grieve? or will you be longer with your Tonya?" "Oh, I might stay 2 or 3 days this trip," said the kid, yawning. "I've been on the dodge for a month, and I'd like to rest up." He was gone half an hour for his tobacco. When he returned, Tonya was still lying in the hammock. "It's funny," said the kid, "how I feel. I feel like there is somebody lying behind every bush and tree waiting to shoot me. I never had mullygrubs like this before. Maybe it's one of those presumptions. I've got half a notion to light out of here in the morning before day. The Guadalupe County is burning up about the old Dutchman I plugged down there." "You are not afraid? No one could make my brave little one fear." "Well, I haven't been usually regarded as a jackrabbit when it comes to scrapping, but I don't want a posse smoking me out when I'm in your jacal. Somebody might get hurt that oughtn't to." "Remain with your Tonya. No one will find you here." The kid looked keenly into the shadows up and down the arroyo and toward the dim lights of the Mexican village. "I'll see how it looks later on," was his decision. At midnight a horseman ran into the ranger's camp, blazing his way by noisy halloos to indicate a pacific mission. Sandridge and one of the other two turned out to investigate the row. The rider announced himself to be Domingo Salas, from the Lone Wolf Crossing. He bore a letter for Señor Sandridge. Old Luisa the lavanderia had persuaded him to bring it, he said, her son Gregorio being too ill of a fever to ride. Sandridge lighted the camp lantern and read the letter. These were its words: "Dear one, he has come. Hardly had you ridden away when he came out of the pear. When he first talked, he said he would stay 3 days or more. Then, as it grew later, he was like a wolf or a fox, and walked about without resting, looking and listening. Soon he said he must leave before daylight, when it is dark and stillest. And then he seemed to suspect that I was not true to him. He looked at me so strange that I am frightened. I swear to him that I love him, his own Tonya. Last of all, he said I must prove to him that I am true. He thinks that even now men are waiting to kill him as he rides from my house. To escape, he says he will dress in my clothes, my red skirt and the blue waist I wear, and the brown mantilla over the head, and thus ride away. But before that, he said I must put on his clothes, his pantalones and camisa and hat, and ride away on his horse from the jacal as far as the big road beyond the crossing and back again. This before he goes, so he can tell if I am true, and if men are hidden to shoot him. It is a terrible thing. An hour before daybreak this is to be. Come, my dear, and kill this man, and take me for your Tonya. Don't try to take hold of him alive, but kill him quickly. Knowing all, you should do that. You must come long before the time and hide yourself in the little shed near the jacal, where the wagons and saddles are kept. It is dark in there. He will wear my red skirt and blue waist and brown mantilla. I send you 100 kisses. Come surely and shoot quickly and straight. Thine own Tonya." Sandridge quickly explained to his men the official part of the missive. The rangers protested against his going alone. "I'll get him easy enough," said the lieutenant. "The girl's got him trapped, and don't even think he'll get the drop on me." Sandridge saddled his horse and rode to the Lone Wolf Crossing. He tied his big gun in the clump of brush on the arroyo, took his Winchester from its scabbard, and carefully approached the Perez jacal. There was only half of a high moon drifted over the ragged, milk-white Gulf clouds. The wagon shed was an excellent place for an ambush, and the ranger got inside it safely. In the black shadow of the brush shelter in front of the jacal, he could see a horse tied, and hear him impatiently pawing at the hard-trodden earth. He waited almost an hour before 2 figures came out of the jacal. One in man's clothes quickly mounted the horse and galloped past the wagon shed toward the crossing and the village. And then the other figure, in skirt, waist, and mantilla over its head, stepped out into the faint moonlight, gazing after the rider. Sandridge thought he would take his chance then, before Tonya rode back. He fancied she might not care to see it. "Throw up your hands," he ordered loudly, stepping out of the wagon shed with his Winchester at his shoulder. There was a quick turn of the figure, but no movement to obey. So the ranger pumped in the bullets, 1, 2, 3, and then twice more, for you never could be too sure of bringing down the Cisco Kid. There was no danger of missing at 10 paces, even in the half moonlight. The old ancestor, asleep on his blanket, was awakened by the shots. Listening further, he heard a great cry from some man in mortal distress or anguish, and rose up grumbling at the disturbing ways of moderns. The tall, red ghost of a man burst into the jacal, reaching one hand, shaking like a tule reed, for the lantern hanging on its nail. The other spread a letter on the table. "Look at this letter, Perez," cried the man. "Who wrote it?" "Ay Dios! It is Señor Sandridge," mumbled the old man, approaching. "Pues, señor, that letter was written by El Chivato, as he is called, by the man of Tonia. They say he is a bad man. I do not know. While Tonia slept, he wrote the letter and sent it by this old hand of mine to Domingo Salas, to be brought to you. Is there anything wrong in the letter? I am very old, and do not know. Válgame Dios, it is a very foolish world, and there is nothing in the house to drink. Nothing to drink." Just then, all that Sandridge could think of to do was to go outside and throw himself face downward in the dust by the side of his hummingbird, of whom not a feather fluttered. He was not a caballo by instinct, and he could not understand the niceties of revenge. A mile away, the rider who had ridden past the wagon shed struck up a harsh, untuneful song, the words of which began, "Don't you monkey with my Lulu girl, or I'll tell you what I'll do." End of The Caballero's Way by O. Henry.
Cousin Amy by W. Somerset Maugham. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Berard. Cousin Amy by W. Somerset Maugham. From the Pall Mall Magazine of 1908. Amy is the daughter of my grandmother's nephew by marriage. I cannot imagine that she is any relative of mine, but she insists that we are cousins, and we call one another by our Christian names. Her idea of the connection is that she should treat me with all the unpleasant frankness of a close relation, while on my side there should be the extreme politeness, the flattering attentiveness of a distant acquaintance. That was all very well when I was 18 and Cousin Amy 26. But now I am 35, and Cousin Amy has ceased to count her birthdays. She does not realize that this makes all the difference in the world, and I have never been able to find the exact words in which to frame so delicate a statement. Cousin Amy lives in the country, and I was much surprised to meet her face to face in Piccadilly. She shook me warmly by the hand. "How nice to see you after all these ages! We must have a talk, mustn't we?" I replied that it would be very agreeable. "Well, I am only here for 24 hours," she pursued. "Are you doing anything this evening?" "No, I'm not," I replied with alacrity. I thought it would be pleasant to dine, for once in a way, at Cousin Amy's expense. In years gone by she had been apt to presume too far on the privilege, which her sex has never shown any wish to dispute with mine, of paying the bill. "That's capital," she said. "Then you can take me out to dinner." "The prospect fills me with enthusiasm," I retorted icily. "You know I've become a food reformer." "This is nuts," I murmured softly to myself, considering that the fruit in question was reported to be not only nutritious, but cheap. I went on with more earnestness. "And where does one eat reformed food?" "Oh, anywhere," she answered airily. "I'm not a faddist, you know. Now I'm going to tell you something very extraordinary. I've never dined at the Ritz." There was a pause, during which you might have heard a pin drop in Piccadilly, but Amy broke it gaily. "Well, I'll meet you there at 8, shall I? And don't order anything beforehand, since I eat next to nothing, you know." This, at any rate, was consoling, for I had been saving up my money in order to spend a week in Paris and improve my mind. Amy tripped lightly away, and I, finding I had but a couple of pounds in my pocket, thought it would be wise in case of emergency to change a cheque. When we sat down in the evening, Cousin Amy put her gloves on the table and looked around with a happy smile. "I know we're going to have a charming dinner," she said. The waiter handed me the menu, but Cousin Amy is a practical woman. "Now you'd far better let me order my own dinner," she said. "I only want a snack. And you see, as I can't eat dead beasts, I'd better choose what I can eat." The proposal seemed eminently reasonable. Amy cast her eye down the menu. "At all events, we can start with some hors d'oeuvres," she said. "Oh, and how delicious! There's potage bisque." I had observed in my glance at the bill of fare that this was the most expensive soup on the list, but Cousin Amy never noticed these things. I wondered acidly how she had researched the quite mature age which I positively knew was hers, without acquiring the elements of common decency. I ordered the hors d'oeuvres and the potage bisque. "What fish, sir?" said the waiter. Cousin Amy frowned at the menu. "It seems very extraordinary that you have no salmon," she said, in the arrogant way in which women generally address their inferiors. "It must be in season." "Well, we have some, madame, but we haven't put it on the card. This is the first we've had." "There!" said Cousin Amy in triumph. "You see, you can always get things if you ask for them. I shuddered to think of the price I should have to pay for salmon which had only come on the London market that morning. I made up my mind that I should have to choose a cheaper hotel in Paris than the one upon which I had fixed. I pointed out to Amy that no woman who respected herself could eat a red fish after a red soup. Yes, I know that. I do feel rather a barbarian, but I must eat salmon, as it's full of proteids." "But surely," I protested, "you told me that you never ate horrible dead beasts." Amy opened her eyes wide. "Oh, that only applies to warm-blooded creatures. Otherwise I couldn't have eaten the soup." "It's lucky there's not whale on the menu," I murmured, as I meekly ordered the salmon. I was beginning to think that one did oneself rather well on reformed food. The hors d'oeuvres were set on the table, and Amy, explaining that she had to eat what she could, emptied the entire contents of 3 dishes on her plate. I thought they looked rather nice myself, but I hadn't the face to ask the waiter for more. Then another waiter brought me a list of wines. This was my opportunity, and I seized it like a man. Cousin Amy was certainly growing uncommonly stout, and it is well known that obesity is best treated by abstention from liquid for 2 hours after the repast. "As a food reformer, I take it that you only have a cup of coffee after eating?" I said. "I shall have a whiskey and soda." "How did you get such a ridiculous idea into your head?" she answered briskly. "On the contrary, my doctor has ordered me to drink wine. You see, I have to keep myself up." "Ah! What will you have?" I said gloomily. "Oh, I don't really mind, so long as it's very dry." I looked at Cousin Amy. "Do you remember the story of the man who was taking a pretty American out to dinner? He asked her what she would drink. 'I guess I'll have champagne,' she said. 'Guess again,' he answered." "What a sell!" cried Amy, laughing merrily. I have read somewhere that women have a greater delicacy of perception than men. I certainly never knew any one slower than Cousin Amy to take a hint. She watched me turn over the pages. "If you really have no preference," she said, "I think I would like Veuve Clicquot. I always feel that we women ought to stand together." It appeared that Cousin Amy was a suffragist, as well as a food reformer, and after I had ordered the champagne which accorded with her principles, she favoured me with her views on the cause. Amy thoroughly enjoyed the potage bisque, and she positively gloated over the salmon. The obsequious waiter came for further orders. "Now you see what an economical person I am to have to dinner," said Amy. Anyone else would ask for entrees and roasts and all kinds of abominations like that. But I only want a couple of vegetables, and I've done." "I remember your saying you only wanted a snack." She turned to the waiter. She thinks it is so nice to get on friendly terms with a waiter. She likes him to take an intelligent interest in her food. "Now I'll tell you what I want. You know those great big asparagus, as large round as your arm? Well, I want some of them." "Very good, madame," said he. "It's so lucky I came up to town just when things I really like are in season," she reflected. "In the country we shall have to wait another 3 months for asparagus and green peas." "You will order some peas, won't you?" "Certainly, if you think you can eat them," I said politely. "Ah, now you see what a difference it makes to eat in a rational manner. I can eat anything, my dear boy, anything." "I'm quite willing to believe it," I retorted. She looked at me and smiled broadly. "But I don't want you to sacrifice yourself on my account. I'm not narrow minded, and if you want some flesh I have no objection to your having it." A pile of asparagus and a great many green peas were set before us, and I knew they were worth their weight in gold. I began to feel more than doubtful about my trip to Paris. "It's very kind of you," I answered, "but I seldom have more than a steak for dinner, and after devouring the meal you've ordered I shall feel like a boa constrictor." "You see, one has to get the proper amount of proteids in," Amy replied calmly, as she ate the giant asparagus. I ate one or two myself, but I was no match for Amy. I no longer wondered that she was growing stout, and I thought that if anybody did marry her, he should be warned in time that to feed a food reformer is no joking matter. When there was one long monster left on the dish, she seized it deliberately. "I must eat that one," she said. "It means a handsome husband and 5,000 a year." "He'll want it," I replied. "I thought I should only spoil my dinner if I had tea," she murmured reflectively. "That was very considerate of you," I answered. She leaned back with a sigh and looked at me. "How pleased I am to have caught you before you went to Paris." "I very much doubt whether I shall be able to afford to go," I said. Cousin Amy is an optimist. "After all, there's no place like home," she answered cheerily. "If you go to Paris you'll probably get typhoid, and you'll certainly spend much more money than you can afford." Cousin Amy has often besought me to be economical. She takes a cousinly interest in my finances. At last she finished the peas, and I felt that I could eat nothing more for a week. Amy was in high spirits. "Now a little sweet and a little dessert, and I'm done." I began to admire Amy. I should have liked to introduce the fat boy of Pekin to her. "Poires à la Melba," she ordered, with one glance at the menu. With unerring instinct she had hit upon the specialty of the house. I decided definitely not to go to Paris after all. "Delicious, aren't they?" she said. We reached the dessert, and I became weak and silly when she said she had not had strawberries and cream that year. Neither had many other people. Strawberries and cream were brought, mixed together in a huge bowl, and for a fixed sum, a rather large sum, it seemed to me. You could eat as many as you liked. It was some consolation to me that Amy certainly had her money's worth. When she had done, she leaned back. "After all, one misses a great deal if one is a food reformer. But one has the consciousness that one is advancing a good cause. And besides, in Lent one has the advantage of killing two birds with one stone." We had coffee, and I discovered that Amy had a fine taste in liqueur brandy. She told me her doctor wouldn't let her drink it unless it was very old. When the bill came, I congratulated myself on the fact that Amy had only wanted a snack, for if she had been really hungry I don't know what I should have done. When we parted she shook hands with me. "I have enjoyed myself," she said. "I'm so sorry I'm not staying in town longer, but you must come and lunch with me to morrow. My system is chop for chop you know." This was new in Cousin Amy, and I put the change down to the advance of years, which have a soft logic of their own. "I shall be delighted," I answered promptly. "Where shall we go?" She looked at me with the utmost effrontery. "What do you say to the Eustace Miles restaurant? I should so much like to show you what a vegetarian restaurant is really like." I have no presence of mind in emergencies, and I accepted Cousin Amy's invitation. But as I wandered away in the rain, I really couldn't afford a hansom. A sadder, poorer, wiser, and much over-eaten man, I murmured to myself, "She may call it chop for chop, if she likes. I call it carrot soup for potage bisque." End of Cousin Amy, by W. Somerset Maugham.
The Necklace by Guy de Maupassant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Peter Tomlinson, London, March 2017. She was one of those pretty and charming girls born, as if by an error of fate, into a family of clerks. She had no dowry, no expectations, no means of becoming known, understood, loved, or wedded by a man of wealth and distinction. And so she let herself be married to a minor official at the Ministry of Education. She dressed plainly because she had never been able to afford anything better, but she was as unhappy as if she had once been wealthy. Women don't belong to a caste or class. Their beauty, grace, and natural charm take the place of birth and family. Natural delicacy, instinctive elegance, and a quick wit determine their place in society and make the daughters of commoners the equals of the very finest ladies. She suffered endlessly, feeling she was entitled to all the delicacies and luxuries of life. She suffered because of the poorness of her house, as she looked at the dirty walls, the worn-out chairs, and the ugly curtains. All these things that another woman of her class would not even have noticed tormented her and made her resentful. The sight of the little Brenton girl who did her housework filled her with terrible regrets and hopeless fantasies. She dreamed of silent antechambers hung with oriental tapestries, lit from above by torches in bronze holders, while two tall footmen in knee-length breeches napped in huge armchairs, sleepy from the stove's oppressive warmth. She dreamt of vast living rooms furnished in rare old silks, elegant furniture loaded with priceless ornaments, and inviting smaller rooms, perfumed, made for afternoon chats with close friends, famous, sought-after men who all women envy and desire. When she sat down to dinner at a round table covered with a 3-day-old cloth, opposite her husband, who, lifting the lid off the soup, shouted excitedly, "Ah, beef stew! What could be better?" She dreamed of fine dinners, of shining silverware, of tapestries which peopled the walls with figures from another time, and strange birds in fairy forests. She dreamed of delicious dishes served on wonderful plates, of whispered gallantries listened to with an inscrutable smile as one ate the pink flesh of a trout or the wings of a quail. She had no dresses, no jewels, nothing, and these were the only things she loved. She felt she was made for them alone. She wanted so much to charm, to be envied, to be desired and sought after. She had a rich friend, a former schoolmate at the convent, whom she no longer wanted to visit because she suffered so much when she came home. For whole days afterwards she would weep with sorrow, regret, despair, and misery. One evening her husband came home with an air of triumph, holding a large envelope in his hand. "Look," he said, "here's something for you." She tore open the paper and drew out a card on which was printed the words, "The Minister of Education and Madame Georges Ramponneau request the pleasure of M. and Madame Loisel's company at the Ministry on the evening of Monday, January the 18th." Instead of being delighted as her husband had hoped, she threw the invitation on the table resentfully and muttered, "What do you want me to do with that?" "But, my dear, I thought you'd be pleased. You never go out, and it will be such a lovely occasion. I had awful trouble getting it. Everyone wants to go. It's very exclusive, and they're not giving many invitations to clerks. The whole ministry will be there." She stared at him angrily and said impatiently, "And what do you expect me to wear if I go?" He hadn't thought of that. He stammered, "Why, the dress you go to the theatre in. It seems very nice to me." He stopped, stunned, distressed to see his wife crying. Two large tears ran slowly from the corners of her eyes towards the corners of her mouth. He stuttered, "What's the matter? What's the matter?" With great effort she overcame her grief and replied in a calm voice as she wiped her wet cheeks, "Nothing, and I have no dress, and so I can't go to this party. Give your invitation to a friend whose wife has better clothes than I do." He was distraught, but tried again. "Let's see, Matilda. How much would a suitable dress cost? One which you could use again on other occasions. Something very simple?" She thought for a moment, computing the cost, and also wondering what amount she could ask for without an immediate refusal and an alarmed exclamation from the thrifty clerk. At last she answered hesitantly, "I don't know exactly, but I think I could do it with 400 francs." He turned a little pale because he had been saving that extra amount to buy a gun and treat himself to a hunting trip the following summer in the country near Nanterre with a few friends who went lark shooting there on Sundays. However, he said, "Very well, I can give you 400 francs, but try and get a really beautiful dress." The day of the party drew near, and Madame Loisel seemed sad, restless, anxious. Her dress was ready, however. One evening her husband said to her, "What's the matter? You've been acting strange these last 3 days." She replied, "I'm upset that I have no jewels, not a single stone to wear. I will look cheap. I would almost rather not go to the party." "You could wear flowers," he said. "They are very fashionable at this time of year. For 10 francs you could get 2 or 3 magnificent roses." She was not convinced. "No, there is nothing more humiliating than looking poor in the middle of a lot of rich women." "How stupid you are!" her husband cried. "Go and see your friend Madame Forestier and ask her to lend you some jewels. You know her well enough for that." She uttered a cry of joy. "Of course, I had not thought of that." The next day she went to a friend's house and told her of her distress. Madame Forestier went to her mirrored wardrobe, took out a large box, brought it back, opened it, and said to Madame Loisel, "Choose, my dear." First she saw some bracelets, then a pearl necklace, then a gold Venetian cross set with precious stones of exquisite craftsmanship. She tried on the jewellery in the mirror, hesitated, could not bear to part with them, to give them back. She kept asking, "You have nothing else?" "Why, yes, but I don't know what you like." Suddenly she discovered, in a black satin box, a superb diamond necklace, and her heart began to beat with uncontrolled desire. Her hands trembled as she took it. She fastened it round her neck, over her high-necked dress, and stood lost in ecstasy as she looked at herself. Then she asked anxiously, hesitating, "Would you lend me this, just this?" "Why, yes, of course." She threw her arms round her friend's neck, embraced her rapturously, then fled with her treasure. The day of the party arrived. Madame Loisel was a success. She was prettier than all the other women, elegant, gracious, smiling, and full of joy. All the men stared at her, asked her name, tried to be introduced. All the cabinet officials wanted to waltz with her. The minister noticed her. She danced wildly, with passion, drunk on pleasure, forgetting everything in the triumph of her beauty, in the glory of her success, in a sort of cloud of happiness made up of all this respect, all this admiration, all these awakened desires, of that sense of triumph that is so sweet to a woman's heart. She left at about 4 o'clock in the morning. Her husband had been dozing since midnight in a little deserted anteroom with 3 other gentlemen whose wives were having a good time. He threw over her shoulders the clothes he had brought for her to go outside in, the modest clothes of an ordinary life, whose poverty contrasted sharply with the elegance of the ball dress. She felt this and wanted to run away, so she wouldn't be noticed by the other women who were wrapping themselves in expensive furs. Loisel held her back. "Wait a moment. You'll catch a cold outside. I'll go and find a cab." But she would not listen to him and ran down the stairs. When they were finally in the street, they could not find a cab and began to look for one, shouting at the cabman they saw passing in the distance. They walked down the Seine in despair, shivering with cold. At last they found on the quay one of those old night cabs that one sees in Paris only after dark, as if they were ashamed to show their shabbiness during the day. They were dropped off at their door in the Rue des Martyrs, and sadly walked up the steps to their apartment. It was all over for her, and he was remembering that he had to be back at his office at 10 o'clock. In front of the mirror she took off the clothes around her shoulders, taking a final look at herself in all her glory. But suddenly she uttered a cry. She no longer had the necklace round her neck. "What's the matter?" asked her husband, already half undressed. She turned towards him, panic-stricken. I have no longer Madame Forestier's necklace." He stood up, distraught. "What? How? That's impossible." They looked in the folds of her dress, in the folds of her cloak, in her pockets, everywhere, but they could not find it. "Are you sure you still had it on when you left the ball?" he asked. "Yes, I touched it in the hall at the ministry." "But if you had lost it in the street we would have heard it fall. It must be in the cab." "Yes, that's probably it. Did you take his number?" "No. And you? Didn't you notice it?" "No." They stared at each other, stunned. At last Loisel put his clothes on again. "I'm going back," he said, "over the whole route we walked. See if I can find it." He left. She remained in her ball dress all evening, without the strength to go to bed, sitting on a chair with no fire, her mind blank. Her husband returned at about 7 o'clock. He had found nothing. He went to the police, to the newspapers to offer a reward, to the cab companies. Everywhere the tiniest glimmer of hope led him. She waited all day, in the same state of blank despair from before this frightful disaster. Loisel returned in the evening, a hollow, pale figure. He had found nothing. "You must write to your friend," he said. "Tell her you have broken the clasp of her necklace and that you are having it mended. It will give us time to look some more." She wrote as he dictated. At the end of 1 week they had lost all hope, and Loisel, who had aged 5 years, declared, "We must consider how to replace the jewel." The next day they took the box which had held it and went to the jeweller whose name they found inside. He consulted his books. "It was not I, madam, who sold the necklace. I must simply have supplied the case." And so they went from jeweller to jeweller, looking for a necklace like the other one, consulting their memories, both sick with grief and anguish. In a shop on the Palais Royal they found a string of diamonds which seemed to be exactly what they were looking for. It was worth 40,000 francs. They could have it for 36,000. So they begged the jeweller not to sell it for 3 days, and they made an arrangement that he would take it back for 34,000 francs if the other necklace was found before the end of February. Loisel had 18,000 francs which his father had left him. He would borrow the rest. And he did borrow, asking for 1,000 francs from one man, 500 from another, 5 louis here, 3 louis there. He gave notes, made ruinous agreements, dealt with usurers, with every type of moneylender. He compromised the rest of his life, risked signing notes without knowing if he could ever honour them, and, terrified by the anguish still to come, by the black misery about to fall on him, by the prospect of every physical privation and every moral torture he was about to suffer, he went to get the new necklace and laid down on the jeweller's counter 36,000 francs. When Madame Loisel took the necklace back, Madame Forestier said coldly, "You should have returned it sooner. I might have needed it." To the relief of her friend, she did not open the case. If she had detected the substitution, what would she have thought? What would she have said? Would she have taken her friend for a thief? From then on, Madame Loisel knew the horrible life of the very poor. But she played her part heroically. The dreadful debt must be paid. She would pay it. They dismissed their maid, they changed their lodgings, they rented a garret under the roof. She came to know the drudgery of housework, the odious labours of the kitchen. She washed the dishes, staining her rosy nails on greasy pots and the bottom of pans. She washed the dirty linen, the shirts and the dishcloths, which she hung to dry on a line. She carried the garbage down to the street every morning and carried up the water, stopping at each landing to catch her breath. And dressed like a commoner, she went to the fruiterers, the grocers, the butchers, her basket on her arm, bargaining, insulted, fighting over every miserable sou. Each month they had to pay some notes, renew others, get more time. Her husband worked every evening, doing accounts for a tradesman, and often, late into the night, he sat copying a manuscript at 5 sous a page. And this life lasted 10 years. At the end of 10 years they had paid off everything, at usurer's rates and with the accumulations of compound interest. Madame Loisel looked old now. She had become strong, hard, and rough like all women of impoverished households. With hair half combed, with skirts awry, and reddened hands, she talked loudly as she washed the floor with great swishes of water. But sometimes when her husband was at the office, she sat down near the window and thought of that evening at the ball so long ago when she had been so beautiful and so admired. What would have happened if she had not lost that necklace? Who knows? Who knows? How strange life is, how fickle, how little is needed for one to be ruined or saved. One Sunday, as she was walking in the Champs-Élysées to refresh herself after the week's work, suddenly she saw a woman walking with a child. It was Madame Forestier, still young, still beautiful, still charming. Madame Loisel felt emotional. Should she speak to her? Yes, of course. And now that she had paid, she would tell her all. Why not? She went up to her. "Good morning, Jeanne." The other, astonished to be addressed so familiarly by this common woman, did not recognize her. She stammered. "But, madame, I don't know. You must have made a mistake. No, I am Mathilde Loisel." Her friend uttered a cry. "Oh, my poor Mathilde, how you have changed! Yes, I've had some hard times since I last saw you, and many miseries, and all because of you." "Me? How can that be? You remember that diamond necklace that you lent me to wear to the ministry party?" "Yes. Well?" "Well, I lost it." "What do you mean? You brought it back." "I brought you back another exactly like it, and it has taken us 10 years to pay for it. It wasn't easy for us. We had very little, but at last it is over, and I am very glad." Madame Forestier was stunned. "You say that you bought a diamond necklace to replace mine?" "Yes. You didn't notice then?" They were very similar, and she smiled with proud and innocent pleasure. Madame Forestier, deeply moved, took both her hands. "Oh, my poor Mathilde, mine was an imitation. It was worth 500 francs at most." End of The Necklace by Guy de Maupassant.
The Grand Opera by Billy Baxter. from the wit and humor of America. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothman. The Grand Opera by Billy Baxter. Well, I decided to get into my class, so I started for the smoking room. I hadn't gotten 3 feet till some woman held me up and began to tell me how she adored grand opera. I didn't even reply. I fled madly and remained hidden in the tall grass of the smoking room until it was time to go home. Jim, should anyone ever tell you that grand opera is all right, he's either trying to even up or he's not a true friend. I was over in New York with a family last winter, and they made me go with them to Die Valkyrie at the Metropolitan Opera House. When I got the tickets, I asked the man's advice as to the best location. He said that all true lovers of music occupied the dress circle and the balconies, and that he had some good center dress circle seats at 3 bones per. Here's a tip, Jim. If the boxman ever hands you that true lover game, just reach in through the little hole and soak him in the solar for me. It's coming to him. I'll give you my word of honor, we were 1/4 of a mile from the stage. We went up in an elevator, were shown to our seats, and who was right behind us but my old pal Bud Hathaway from Chicago. Bud had his 2 sisters with him, and he gave me one sad look, which said plainer than words, "So you're up against it too, huh?" We introduced all hands around, and about 9 o'clock the curtain went up. After we had waited fully 10 minutes, out came a big, fat, greasy-looking dago with nothing on but a bear robe. He went over to the side of the stage and sat down on a bum rock. It was plainly to be seen, even from my true lover's seat, that his bearlets was sorer than a dog about something. Presently in came a woman, and none of the true lovers seemed to know who she was. Some said it was Melba, others Nordica. Bud and I decided that it was May Irwin. We were mistaken, though, as Irwin has this woman lashed to the mast at any time or place. As soon as Mike the Dago espied the dame, it was all off. He rushed and drove a straight-arm jab, which had it reached would have given him the purse. But Shifty Sadie wasn't there. She ducked, sidestepped, and landed a clever half-arm hook, which seemed to stun the big fellow. They clinched and swayed back and forth, growling continually, while the orchestra played this trembly Liza Cross the Ice music. Jim, I'm not swelling this a bit. On the level, it happened just as I write it. All of a sudden, someone seemed to win. They broke away and ran wildly to the front of the stage with their arms outstretched, yelling to beat 3 of a kind. The band cut loose something fierce. The leader tore out about $9 worth of hair and acted generally as though he had bats in his belfry. I thought surely the place would be pinched. It reminded me of Thirsty Thornton's dance hall out in Merrill, Wisconsin, when the Silent Swede used to start a general survival of the fittest every time Mamie the Mink danced twice in succession with the young fellow from Albany, whose father owned the big mill up Rough River. Of course, this audience was perfectly orderly and showed no intention whatever of cutting in, and there were no chairs or glasses in the air, but I am forced to admit that the opera had Thornton's faded on noise. I asked Bud what the trouble was, and he answered that I could search him. The audience apparently went wild. Everybody said, "Simply sublime! Isn't it grand? Perfectly superb! Bravo!" etc. Not because they really enjoyed it, but merely because they thought it was the proper thing to do. After that, for 3 solid hours, Rough House Mike and Shifty Sadie seemed to be apologizing to the audience for the disgraceful street brawl, which was honestly the only good thing in the show. Along about 12 o'clock, I thought I would talk over old times with Bud, but when I turned his way, I found my tired and trusty comrade asleep at the switch. At the finish, the woman next to me, who seemed to be on, said the main lady was dying. After it was too late, Mike seemed kind of sorry. He must have given her the knife or the drops, because there wasn't a minute when he could look in on her according to the rules. He laid her out on the bum rock, they set off a lot of red fire for some unknown reason, and the curtain dropped at 12:25. Never again for my money. Far be it from me knocking, but any time I want noise, I'll take a boiler shop or a Union Station, where I can understand what's coming off. I'm for a good mother show. Do you remember The White Slave, Jim? Well, that's me. Wasn't it immense where the main lady spurned the leering villain's gold and exclaimed with flashing eyes, "Rags or royal raiment, when worn for virtue's sake"? Great! The White Slave had Die Valkyrie beaten to a pulp, and they don't get you for 3 cases gate money either. End of The Grand Opera by Billy Baxter.